Anastasia, let's go back a couple years and speak of the turmoil. Link in a higher oil price, real inflation worries that Mr. Erdogan has, some would say self-inflicted, and the destabilization of Turkey. How idiosyncratic is it, or can it be a contagion?
Oh, well, Tom, I do think at this moment it is idiosyncratic to Turkey, and there's just too many issues in Turkey that have been building up for too long. You know, the current account deficit issues, you know, the rundown of the reserves. And when inflation is running at 20%, the last thing you do is cut interest rates. So this is a bit of a self-inflicted damage here. And I don't think it's representative of other things that are happening in emerging markets, but perhaps identifying pockets of vulnerability is once again something that we need to do. Who has the twin deficits, who has low reserves, and who may not be able to withstand hikes from the Federal Reserve and higher dollar. That might be one of the questions that we have for emerging markets in 2022. But broadly speaking, a lot of them are much improved since 2013, though.
There's also a larger question here of Erdogan fighting free markets and this idea of how much on a broader level policymakers are trying to fight free markets and trying to jawbone down prices or jawbone up valuations. How do you operate as an investor at a time when policymakers, and I'm thinking of the Federal Reserve in particular, is trying to keep a status quo? And we heard from Yuri and Timur earlier, the markets will win because they do not want to disrupt them.
Well, I think the markets do ultimately prevail and the supply-demand balances prevail. And just to go back to the oil reserves and the release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for a moment, it is a temporary move. I think it's kind of the only thing that's within policy control at the moment, but is going to be a small move. I will say the release reserve that we're seeing is more than consensus was expecting. But even if we release 30 million barrels, that was likely to translate into a downturn in price of $2 a barrel or so. And so we're probably going to see something more than that. Of course, a lot of it was front loaded. But I do agree that this is just a temporary sense of control that I think policymakers are trying to exercise. But at the end of the day, it is what is supply demand going to be? And for the broader economy, what is demand going to be and what is inflation going to do? So that's what the policymakers really need to respond to.
Well, what strikes me about this reserve release, Anastasia, is that we've seen it 3 times emergency releases in U.S. history. It was during Desert Storm, Katrina, and then when with the question of Libya in 2011. All of those were because you couldn't get the capacity. You didn't have access to that production. That's not the issue here. You could see a ramping up of output for OPEC Plus, or you could see shale players start to pump more oil. They're just not doing it. So how does that make this different?
Yeah, so it does set up a bit of a fight here, I will say, because clearly that's not something OPEC Plus wanted to see happen, is to have this coordinated strategic release. And that's why they're starting to talk about potentially, not ramping up their production. But the reality that OPEC has to grapple with is that we are likely to be in a surplus market next year versus the deficit that we've had. So I think they're going to calibrate their response carefully to that.
Very quickly, Anastasia, do we need a strategic Bitcoin reserve? Let's go to your present wheelhouse.
Well, I do think more and more companies and more individuals are building up their cryptocurrency reserves. And I would expand that beyond Bitcoin, Tom, because Bitcoin has been a great trade this year because inflation was surging and because the Fed was not doing anything about it. Now that the dollar is moving higher and the Fed is seemingly going to do something about inflation next year, Bitcoin has lost a little bit of its shine. So there's 2 things I would say about that. First of all, you take a step back and look at the broader adoption trends of something like Bitcoin. And I do think that's going to continue to grow, inflation notwithstanding. But near term, there's other cryptocurrencies that I think do play a good role in the cryptocurrency reserve.